Hey everyone, welcome back to Philosophy and welcome for the first time to reading Plato. I'm going to say a little bit today just to introduce Plato, his life, the historical context surrounding that, as I assume you're working your way through Book One of the Republic around now. Um, so Plato lived in 4th century BC, ancient Athens, part of the larger kind of complicated archipelago of Greek city-states. And this is at a time when Athens is really starting to become clearly the most advanced of those Greek city-states. So a real time of ascendancy for the Athenians at the time that Plato is living. He was born to a prominent family, wealthy family. He served in the military as men from prominent families did at that time. And certainly, so the most important event of Plato's life must be when he met Socrates as a young man. So it's really impossible to talk about Plato without saying at least a bit about Socrates. As you've already seen from reading the Republic, Socrates is Plato's almost only mouthpiece. Almost everything that Plato wrote takes the form of what you're reading now, with Socrates as kind of the main protagonist, going around and having conversations with people in ancient Athens about things like what justice is, for example. So this story that you get, as it is, it officially is, at least in part, this story about Socrates that you're reading is a representation of the way that Plato came to meet him, came to be associated with him. Socrates was this guy who started wandering around ancient Athens really only in his old age, starting in his old age. Socrates had a military career himself before that. Starting in his old age, so Socrates develops this kind of group of disciples, young men from mostly prominent, politically important families. And Plato was among those and eventually became the most brilliant of them, the most successful of Socrates' students. In 399 BC, Socrates is executed by the people of Athens, by the government of Athens. That's a good kind of benchmark date to remember if you're trying to keep some chronology in your head. 399 BC is the death of Socrates. And so upon the death of Socrates, Plato begins his own literary career. And the dialogues, the earliest ones, tend to be more simple. Scholars generally think that those earliest dialogues are probably more faithful representations of what Socrates' conversations with people were really like. But as Plato's literary career progresses, his dialogues become more and more complex. Socrates himself becomes a more and more complicated character. And the dialogue that we're reading for this week, one of the most significant and one of the most famous of Plato's, The Republic, is also one of his most advanced in terms of literary style, in terms of philosophical sophistication, in terms of Plato really coming into his own as his own voice, independent of Socrates, his mentor, who initially he seems to have been largely kind of imitating. So I'll have occasion later to say more about the style of Plato's writing, strategies for reading him. He is a very unique writer. This is not just like reading an essay where someone's just simply trying to be as clear as possible and present a convincing argument to you. There's a lot more going on than that. So in the next lecture, I'll talk a bit about that. But I want to kind of keep it to history now. So another significant thing about Plato's life, obviously, is his founding of the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the world, the first kind of significant, large-scale institution of higher learning in the world. Aristotle, of course, is one of the students at that academy. Generations and generations of scholars went through it. Then that's kind of operating throughout Plato's adult career. He started it relatively early on. The other last thing I'll say about his life is that, as you're seeing in the Republic, Plato's philosophy spans all different areas of what we now recognize as philosophy, and often things can be kind of intertwined. So the Republic's most proper kind of area of focus is obviously politics, the state. What is justice? That's what we start off talking about here in Book One. But intertwined with it is an entire theory of epistemology, metaphysics, etc. All of this, all the branches of philosophy really flowed together for Plato's way of thinking. And this is all a long-winded way of getting to the point that at one point late in his life, Plato did try to take his philosophical principles and basically apply them to the world, in the sense that he took a trip to Syracuse, in what's now Italy, southern Italy, Sicily, where there was this tyrant, basically, ruling over people, being a tyrant. Plato went and kind of installed himself in this guy's court, tried to make friends with him, and basically tried to convince him of the truth of his principles of justice and of proper statecraft and statesmanship. So I see this as just, an example of Plato refusing to simply remain within the realm of ideas, which maybe it is tempting to think of philosophers as doing. He thought deeply, he lived kind of in the clouds, if you want to think of it in that way, in this kind of abstract realm, but that didn't prevent him from understanding the importance of real life, of real political life, and of trying to make an impact on the real world around him with his ideas. The experiment failed, by the way. The tyrant remained a tyrant. Plato ended up in exile for a while, sold into slavery until someone, bought him back. So that's all I'll say for now about the life itself of Plato. Like a lot of philosophers, actually, a surprising number maybe, he had a pretty interesting life, a life that really did reflect and was intersecting with all of the kind of dramatic changes going on in his generation, in his time. So a little bit, as I finish up here, just about the Greeks more generally. Plato, the legacy of Aristotle, the legacy of all of the ancient Greek philosophers from this classical period is very much bound up with this notion that we have of Western civilization. And that's a term that's become really politically charged recently. I won't say much more than that. Maybe you know what I'm talking about, maybe you don't. When I was in college, Western civilization was the name for just the intro history class that everybody had to take. It seems like that's kind of changed. In any case, though, this idea of Western civilization is often taken to have its roots in ancient Greece, and precisely the generation that we're talking about, this kind of great flowering of science, literature, philosophy, culture, which continues to sustain the Western tradition of literature and thought all the way up to the present. There are some problems with that version of the account of what Western civilization is and how we relate to it as individuals as in the present now. The problem is that that kind of straight line connecting us and the ancient Greeks doesn't exist. There are gaps and kind of jagged lines in the progression of how these ideas came disseminated over time. There are a lot of different institutions of power involved in the dissemination of ancient Greek philosophy and ancient Greek culture and its centrality to modern cultural self-understanding. For one thing, when I say that there's not kind of a straight line connecting us and Plato, for example, well, for a good, several centuries, for a good 700, 800 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire, what is often referred to now as the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages within Europe, at that time, the Muslim world to the south was having really its kind of golden age. And that golden age, cultural golden age for Islamic society was very much rooted in their discovery of ancient Greek philosophy and science and their kind of amalgamation of that with their own tradition of their own very rich tradition of thinkers, scientists, artists, etc. So this is a time when, like, literally throughout Europe, just nobody speaks Greek. Literally 4 centuries, there was just hardly anybody even in existence within European society who could even read the texts of Plato. They weren't translated. The work of preservation, the work of translation, and the work of philosophical engagement with these texts that is necessary to keep a body of thought alive and not just a museum piece was really taking place throughout all these centuries in the Muslim world by Muslim scholars. And it's really questionable what exactly we would have of the Greek legacy now without that work of preservation that they did. So that's just one example of the way in which the idea of Western civilization as this kind of unified thing that connects us directly back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, etc., however you want to kind of tell that narrative, is problematic and needs to be more thought through more in more complicated ways, I think. Again, trying to keep these lectures relatively short. That's about 10 minutes now. I'll have more things to post tomorrow as you're digging into Republic 1. Hope you'll continue reading that. Start to engage with the discussion boards, which I posted the first round of questions for last night. So they should all be up there. Start looking through the discussion boards and participating on there. Yeah, and I will be in touch about other things. All right, thanks.